there's this gray area of marriage that the world views push onto us, whereas the Bible is black and white. I want to talk about that today. I was reading Genesis chapter 2 this morning, where it talks about how God formed woman from Adam. Basically, he took the rib of Adam and made a woman because he believes, God says that no man should be alone. Being alone is not good. But it was something that I wanted to look into and look at the numbers compared to today, from today back to the 1950s, and what the age was, average age was, what the numbers are, and what's causing those numbers to change. And you may say, well, this isn't the 1950s anymore. Things have obviously changed. There's Tinder, there's Hinge, there's the dating apps, there's social media, there's all these things that make it more convenient and easy to access, easy to attain, which is true. But just because things aren't the same as it was in the 1950s doesn't necessarily mean that it is changed for the better. Things can obviously change for the worse. And when looking at these numbers, obviously single-parent households, those numbers have increased. Divorce rates have increased. A lot of these numbers reflect a negative change rather than a positive change. So when you go back to the Bible and what it says in Genesis chapter 2, verse 24, it says, "This is why a man leaves his father and mother and bonds with his wife, and they become one flesh." It's pretty straightforward. You enter into a covenant with man and woman. When you enter into that covenant, you leave your mother and father on the man's side, and you leave your mother and father and family on the woman's side, and enter into one agreement, one covenant as flesh. Whereas the world says that basically you enter into a contract, right? You get married by the courts. And think about how often contracts are breached when people don't follow through on their word. The difference is their word versus God's word, and the covenant of God, the covenant of marriage, entering into one, right? So that's the first difference that I'll mention. But I also want to read off these numbers because things have obviously changed quite a bit since the 1950s. So this is coming from the U.S. Census Bureau. I found this information on ChatGPT, looking at men and women in their 20s. So about 70% of men in their early 20s are single, and same thing for women, about 65%. Whereas in the 1950s, the majority of both men and women in their 20s were married. The difference also back then is that they got married and stayed married, whereas today, again, those divorce rates have climbed substantially. When you look at men and women in their 30s, about 40% of men in their 30s are single, which obviously a pretty significant contrast to what it was in the 50s and 60s. And same thing with women, about 35% of women in their early 30s are single. And it says here, some choose to focus on career, others are impacted by the availability of a suitable partner or shifting personal priorities. So again, kind of putting yourself first. And there's a lot of these activist groups and different foundations that promote, these women's rights and, not even that, but career development. And really what it's doing is making man focus on his own trajectory and woman focusing on her own trajectory. So what's happening is that men and women are both focusing in on themselves, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but they're growing independently. So now you're taking two completely independent people, and eventually maybe late 20s, like me, I'm 26, or early 30s, late 30s, 40s, etc. You get so used to growing individually and developing individually, whereas in the past, in the 1950s, 1960s, men and women were getting married earlier, so they were growing together as a couple, as one. Whereas, you take a man and a woman who have done two completely separate things the majority of their life, and then now they try and, engage in potential relationships. It's a lot tougher because most likely men are set in their ways and the women are set in their ways. Anyways, looking at the numbers of men and women in their 40s. So it says 20 to 25% of men in their 40s are single, and 15 to 20% of women in their 40s are single. And the reasons listed here are that, never married, divorced, or widowed. Whereas obviously mid 20th century, extremely rare for people in their 40s to be unmarried. The thought was you get married, and you stay married. So what are the factors that are contributing to these changes? I mentioned earlier, focusing on career, etc. But really, the growth, the independent growth, rather than growing and developing as one, is what the data is showing has actually led to that. Not only just my opinion. So economic independence is the first thing. So it says greater financial independence, especially for women, has reduced the economic necessity of marriage. Educational attainment, number 2. Higher education levels have led to delayed marriage, as both men and women spend more time pursuing degrees and establishing their own careers. The third is cultural shifts. So there's changing attitudes towards cohabitation, obviously. So it lists off single parenthood. Those numbers have climbed. And the importance of marriage isn't necessarily something that is as important as it was, right? There's really no incentive, if you think about it, to engage in marriage, really, because if you're cohabitating and doing everything prior to marriage, really, what's the incentive of marriage from a secular view? And the last thing here is urbanization. So in urban areas, it says career opportunities are abundant. Individuals often delay marriage in favor of personal and professional development. Again, those are just some numbers I wanted to lay off and provide to you, something to think about. It's pretty interesting, again, because what we read in the Bible is black and white. There isn't much gray area, and the world creates this gray area. Who am I marrying? Should I marry? Is it the right time? All these questions, which are good questions to think about and think through prior to, engagement and marriage and relationships, etc. But just thought that this would be an important message to share, because it looks like from the data that there's been a negative change in this specific area of our lives. So hope you guys found value. If you did, make sure to subscribe and turn on the notifications. Share it with a friend. Leave feedback. I'd love to hear what you guys have to say. Thanks again for watching.